Hi, everybody. It's Mr. Williams. Whether you're watching this because I'm absent or just want some review, this is a video just basically talking you through writing one paragraph, a body paragraph, in your 5 paragraph essay. The general goals today are pretty simple. We're trying to write a quoteburger paragraph where essentially we're going to include two pieces of evidence from two different sources. This is an essay where you're supposed to take evidence from two different places and show how they both show the same thing. In this case, the central idea of two different texts. So it's important that in every paragraph you write, you have two pieces of evidence, one from each, to prove that both back up your answer. So we're going to work on that for making a 5 paragraph essay. We're also going to talk about today, just briefly, adding transitions from paragraph to paragraph. This is something we haven't really discussed at this point of the year, depending on when you're watching this. But basically, knowing that when you start paragraph 2, paragraph 3, your body paragraphs, that you should flow into the next discussion. And so we'll talk about transition. And then we also want to briefly discuss how this will connect to our MCAS testing. They're going to ask you to write a longer essay on that test. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Obviously, if this is after MCAS testing or if we're not talking about MCAS testing, then you can ignore those details. Later on, we'll talk about intros and conclusions. That's not going to be part of this video, but just note today is all about writing one good quoteburger paragraph with two pieces of evidence from two different sources. So here we go. So first things first, you're going to write a thesis. Remember, the thesis's job is to basically say exactly what your essay is going to be about. The thesis in this case is going to cover 3 body paragraphs, so it's going to be not vague, but it's going to be shorter. You can include the 3 topics you want at the end of the thesis. We didn't do that here. Just remember that you're supposed to have that TAP acronym. We have our title of the writings, the author, the prompt. They're going to restate. We also include the genre, although in this case, because one's a letter and one is a poem or a series of poems, you could write both, but you could also just write in the texts, in the readings. That's what we're going to do here. Don't forget your commas to be in the right place as well, which we'll talk about momentarily. And then last but not least, and this is an MCAS discussion, but basically we talked in class about how we haven't really discussed when to use quotation marks versus italics with titles. We haven't really talked about capitalization of titles. We talked about it months ago, but it's been a while. The thing I want to remind you is that on the MCAS, they're going to give you this information, whether it's in the prompt or in a citation right after the reading. So whether you look at the citation right at the end of each reading or just read through the prompt, capitalization for the titles, whether or not it's italicized or in quotation marks, and how to spell things will be there too. That's really important in this case. For instance, I found just in previous tests, there's always some names that are hard to write, or maybe a name that isn't spelled the way you might think. Vivian Whitmore is not easy to spell. Jacqueline Woodson, a lot of people are misspelling Jacqueline all throughout the reading of that book. Just remember this, that perseverance, which will probably be in your prompt. You should spell words correctly that are spelled for you. So make sure you're careful looking at your prompt. And there is absolutely no excuse for misspelling the title, not capitalizing it correctly, not formatting correctly, even if you're not even sure what the rules are for that, because they're going to tell it to you ahead of time. So just make sure you're paying attention. So let's just read this thesis quickly. In the text, comma, Letter to a Dreamer by Vivian Whitmore and Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson, comma, the central idea is that dreams can be achieved with effort and perseverance. And remember, the prompt was something along the lines of, what is a central idea that's developed in both? Remember, the central idea is just the same as main idea. It's what's the focus of these readings. And in this case, they both talked about dreams. They both mentioned effort and perseverance. So we have a nice, solid thesis statement here. Now, we're going to attach this to an intro later. So for now, it's going to just kind of stand alone. But just be aware, this is a good, solid thesis. And if you forget all the tiny ins and outs of it on the MCAS day, you'll be okay as long as you say the titles of the 2 works, or one work if it's just one in the reading, the titles of the authors, or the names of the authors, and restate that idea, whatever it might be in the prompt. So in this case, the prompt talked about central idea. So I want to make sure I directly use that terminology to show that I was paying attention and keep my reader focused. But now that we have our thesis, we can talk about the context. So the context is going to kind of start off our quoteburger here because the thesis has just moved to the top. And this is where things will be a little interesting. We've talked about context before. It's where you give the background information necessary for the reader to understand what's going on with your quote, with your evidence. Now, we have 2 very different texts here. So the context is going to be different depending on what you're talking about. With Letter to a Dreamer, we just have a general letter about how to achieve your dreams. You don't need a lot of context. It's just about achieving dreams. So your context for Letter to a Dreamer is going to be relatively short. However, for Brown Girl Dreaming, we're talking about a memoir where there's context and we might have to give some setup for plot. That's going to be something that we might have to give a little bit more information for. So just be prepared for that. We'll see a difference when we do our next statement in orange for the context. But for now, all we need to say is in order to achieve a dream, comma, individuals must begin with small steps. That's going to be the focus of our first paragraph as we discussed in class. And so just by saying this is going to talk about beginning with small steps to achieve dreams, that's all we really need. And then we're going to get into our speaker tag. Now, this is a little different for an essay with two different texts because not only do we have to say who's speaking, we want to make sure it's clear which reading we're talking about. So in this speaker tag, it says, in Letter to a Dreamer, comma, Whitmore states. Now, Vivian Whitmore's name's at the top. We don't have to give her full name, but we do want to make sure it's clear before they even start that we're talking about Letter to a Dreamer. And by just saying who's speaking and then including that marker verb, in this case, I encourage you to upgrade your language from the word says. We use the word states here. But basically, Whitmore states followed by a comma is all you're going to need for your speaker tag. And remember, the whole purpose of the speaker tag is just to make sure we know right from the start who is speaking, how they're speaking it, and just putting that comma to separate it off from the quote. And one more time, don't forget, because there's two different texts here, you're going to probably start off by saying in Letter to a Dreamer, just to make it very clear where we are. It's just an extra detail to include. And now it's time to include your quote. In class, I tell you to copy and paste from the text. You cannot do that on the MCAS as we've discussed. So just make sure when you write the quote in that you don't have any major typos. You copy it word for word. Just very important to remember that it shows effort and it shows that you're taking your time and being careful. And if you have a major spelling error, it also shows you didn't proofread either. Just make sure you're copying it word for word because even the most difficult words are spelled for you. So it's valuable to make sure you do that correctly. You also want to make sure that your citation is consistent. We're going to talk about MLA citation in a second, which is the parenthetical citation, which we've done in class. But as long as your citation is consistent on an MCAS test, you'll be okay. Still, if you're going to do it correctly, at the end of your quote, get rid of that period, that comma. If it's an exclamation point or a quotation mark in the quote, question mark, leave it there. But we're going to take that period, move it at the end, right after the citation. And all your citation needs is the author's last name and the number. Now, in this case of this MCAS, there aren't page numbers. This is on a computer. So instead of using page numbers, they're going to give you paragraph numbers or line numbers. So use whatever they give you. And once again, as long as you're consistent, you'll be okay. But once again, we have our quote. We end it with a quotation mark. If that quote ends with a period or a comma, get rid of it, move the period to the end. And in parentheses, Whitmore space for, once again, the author's last name and the page number. But let's read this quote just to make sure we know what we're talking about. So the quote says, big dreams start with small steps. Even the tallest trees began as tiny seeds, growing little by little each day. So now our job is to take that quote and show that it connects back to our thesis about central ideas. What's going to be different on this essay is that because we have two quotes that require explanation, we don't want to spend a ton of time taking this first quote and explaining it because we're going to be able to connect this to our second quote later on. So in general, you're probably just going to have one sentence of explanation right after this quote, or maybe you even are going back to back and you have put both your pieces of evidence out there and then have 2 to 3 sentences of explanation. But I just use some figurative language with tallest trees and tiny seeds. I want to make sure I at least give a little bit of information. So I'm going to just explain this quickly. It's just going to say, just like a tree grows from a seed, comma, achieving a big dream starts with initial steps that build on one another. And now I'm going to use my quote from Jacqueline Woodson to kind of really explain what that means. But I've proven I understand what the figurative language was, and now I'm ready to bring in my next quote. Now, because I'm starting a new quote, this is technically the start of a new quoteburger. So I'm going to go back to my color coding. Not that you can do that on MCAS, but I'm going to have my orange, my green, my blue, my light blue again, because I have to set up this quote, give it a speaker tag, quote, citation. So I have my explanation and I'm ready to move on to the next thing. I can transition this a lot of ways, but here's how I did it on my end. And notice this is a longer context. We just talked about this, that Brown Girl Dreaming is a memoir. So we are going to have plot that we have to kind of set up. So it says here, Jacqueline Woodson's memoir, Brown Girl Dreaming, supports this idea by describing Jacqueline's journey to achieving her dream of becoming a storyteller, starting with Jacqueline writing her very first letter. So I'm giving the context for the memoir, how it's going to link back to the previous quote, and just talking about, hey, Jacqueline went on a journey to become a storyteller, and it all started here with her very first letter. I need to give that context so the quote makes sense. And just like the last one, we're going to go through this one a little quickly, but I'm going to have the exact same setup. I actually am going to include the name of the poem. You could even say in her poem, the beginning, in Brown Girl Dreaming. I kind of think of, as I look at this, I kind of wish I added that, so feel free to. But in the poem, the beginning, from Brown Girl Dreaming, you could do that. Woodson explains, same exact thing. I'm saying who's the writer, who's the author, and I'm not using the word says. I want to upgrade, so I say explains. And you could find other words too, obviously. Explains, illustrates, describes, whatever the situation is, as long as the word makes sense. Put the comma at the end of that, and here's my quote. Now, this is poetry, so I'm putting a backslash between every line. Once again, just be consistent. Don't worry about the ... on this. What I've done is, in case you want to do it in the future, I skipped a few lines because they weren't necessary to my quote. So you'll notice in my citation, it says Woodson 1 to 2, 5 to 10, because I skipped lines 3 and 4. You can do that if you'd like, but once again, as long as you're consistent and try your best, you'll be good. So here's the quote. At 3, I now know the letter J. Love the sound of the letter and the promise that one day this will be connected to a full name, my own, that I will be able to write by myself. So I have a clear quote, and I'm ready to now discuss, but I also want to bring it back to not just my thesis about the central idea, but also what I talked about earlier with my previous quote, where I mentioned that big dreams start with initial steps that build on one another. So I want to bring that back into the fold here. Once again, just I didn't talk about it, but don't forget your quote format. Make sure your citation is at the end with a period at the end, and that you quote line numbers or paragraph numbers, whatever they say. And here's our final explanation. Here we go. Woodson starts by learning to write one letter, which leads to writing more letters, then her own name, and eventually other words. Without this initial step, she would never have achieved her dream of becoming a storyteller. So I look back at my previous purple section, my previous explanation, and I wrote a big dream starts with initial steps that build on one another. In my thesis, I said the central idea is a dream that can be achieved with effort, perseverance. In this case, we're talking about effort. And so by just giving a little paraphrase about the quote, Woodson starts by learning to write one letter, and then just bringing that into how that relates to initial steps by saying one letter leads to writing more letters, then writing your own name, then writing other words. I'm kind of showing that this is an important small step. Writing one letter might be a tiny thing, but it ultimately leads to you writing more letters, which leads you to learning words and so on and so forth. You can't become a storyteller, a story writer, without starting off at the beginning, the basis. So we have our explanation here. Notice the one after the second quote's a little bit longer. That's not necessarily something you have to do as long as you are consistent and you show how everything's connected. But we have a good, solid quote burger here. And we've taken 2 quotes from 2 different places. We've cited them. We've set them up. We've given them context. And we've basically explained how they're going to go back to this idea that dreams can be achieved with effort. The small steps are the first steps, but they're also big steps in their own right. So we've kind of explained that. I'm just quickly doing a scan of my notes so I don't forget anything. But overall, this is exactly what you want. Once again, the only thing I'd probably change now that I'm in the middle of the video is I might include, since Brown Girl Dreaming was mentioned in the thesis, just saying that one more time in my speaker tag. But I also mentioned it in my context, so it's not like it's not already there. Your reader's going to know what you're talking about. And so we have a solid quote burger here. Now, the one thing that is missing, if you remember our quote burger colors, is we don't have a closing sentence. So what's happening here is that we have been doing one paragraph essays for forever. So our thesis has been at the top, our closing sentence has been at the bottom, but we're not done yet. We have 2 more paragraphs to go. So that wrap up sentence that kind of wrap up the whole paper, well, that's going to be a big conclusion paragraph at the end of this 5-paragraph essay. So you don't need to have a closing sentence here. You just need to make sure your paragraph ends on a note that feels like you're done talking. So that last sentence there where it says, without this step, she would have never achieved her dream of becoming a storyteller, that kind of wraps up the conversation and you're ready to go into your next paragraph. And the only thing that we're missing now is transition, because we're going to be going from quoteburger paragraph 1 to quoteburger paragraph 2. We're changing topics. It depends on your class what you're going into here. You might be talking about overcoming challenges or staying positive or any other topic that could go there. You just want to transition from your next topic to, or from your current topic to your next topic. There are a lot of ways to do this. If you are not confident with your transition, you could always start off the quoteburger that we just wrote by saying first and then saying second and then a third, or like another reason or another way. You could do stuff like that. The other way to do it is kind of reference your previous paragraph and then move into your next topic, especially if they link up in some way. So I'm just going to show you what I did. And I basically would start my next paragraph by saying, in addition to taking small steps, or along with taking small steps, or after taking small steps, some kind of phrase that just references back to my previous paragraph and then allows me to jump into the next topic. So if this were going to be overcoming challenges, I could say, in addition to taking small steps, dreamers need to be ready to overcome challenges. Or in addition to taking small steps, readers need to stay positive. Whatever it's going to be, I want to make sure I'm referencing maybe achieving a dream. So, in addition to taking small steps, a dreamer needs to overcome challenges to achieve their dream. It just is a way to kind of tell your reader subtly, hey, I'm done with this topic. And now it's on to topic number 2. And so we'll talk more about this in class. Obviously, if you're watching this, you're either not with me or I'm not in class right now. But this is what we have to do. So the 2 new things that we're talking about, once again, are the transitions and having those 2 quotes in our paragraph. We are going to have to practice this. And this is our first try potentially. So just do your best. I'll be in class if you need me. I'll be obviously checking in. And that's really the end of this presentation. So your job now is to get ready to write your own paragraphs. You're going to write body paragraphs 2 and 3. Assuming that that's the lesson that we're doing this year. And if not, we'll continue whatever we talked about in class. But just remember, it's all about making sure when you take, I'm going to restart that sentence. You have learned how to write one quoteburger, which means if you can write one quoteburger paragraph, you can write 2, you can write 3. The only difference is figuring out how to link them all together. So it's that transition part that we're going to talk about. Similarly, as you get older and as you write more complicated essays, you might need multiple quotes in a paragraph. We're doing that here. So same idea, just practicing the idea of adding multiple quotes. Sometimes you might have 2 quotes from the same writing source. It depends. Either way, this is getting more advanced and we're going to work through it. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to help. But I had an ambition to keep this video under 20 and I'm almost there at this point. So if you need any help, once again, feel free to let me know. But hopefully you find this video useful and I will help you and talk to you soon. Bye.